Good afternoon, good evening. My name is KIRILL Gerstein, and you are watching and participating in a series of seminars at the Hanns Eisler Musik Hochschule in Berlin. We're in a virtual space, and this is part of KIRILL Gerstein Invites, and I'm very thrilled to be welcoming John Deathridge to the seminar today, and thrilled that he's with us. John was the King Edward Professor of Music from 1996, and he joined the department after being Reader in Music at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, since 1983. He was also on the faculty of Princeton and Chicago University. He is a performer and one of the world's most renowned experts on Wagner, German music in general, but his interests, I think, are very wide and will inform also what he talks about today. He has a forthcoming book, as he told me, a revisionist reappraisal of the life and work of Beethoven that he's deliberately not bringing out this year, this Beethoven year, but seeing what's happening in this very interesting Beethoven 2020 in lockdown. And there is a new translation of the Wagner Ring that has been published recently. So I'm thrilled that John is with us. John will talk about Wagner and Schubert, as you know, and the idea of the lead in public and private life. Welcome, John. It's great to have you with us.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you, KIRILL. Where do we start?
Yes, you tell us.
Well, you just heard Gretchen am Spinnrade. I mean, this is not a bad place to start, because if you read about the history of the lead, inevitably the date, the 14th of October, 1814 comes up, which is the day on which Schubert wrote Gretchen am Spinnrad. And the old story used to go that this is where the history of the lead begins, because Gretchen am Spinnrad is opus 2, the L-König, both of these are Goethe settings, is opus 1, and I'll be talking about L-König later. But because this story is a bit fictitious, I thought it might be a good idea to go back to the 18th century first, then come to Beethoven, get on to Schubert, and then we'll get on to Wagner. So this is a little bit like a dilapidated car traveling from the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. There's a lot to talk about, and I'm going to generalize really quite a lot, but I am going to talk about the social implications of the lead, and not only that, the relationship of the lead to public spaces, natural spaces. And I thought this might be quite a good idea to do, especially as a lot of us are in lockdown. We can't actually go outside. We're in our spaces, and this is particularly bad for musicians at the moment. And I think we need to remember, especially young musicians who are going through an extremely difficult time. One of the ironies of this is that classical music, and especially German classical music, has expressed this whole problem of the private versus the public and all the interstices in between. So I thought it might be a good idea to start at quite an obscure place, really, which was Mozart's little opera called Bastien and Bastienne, which was probably, we don't know quite for certain, performed in 1767. And I think I'd like to start with two extracts, and I'll explain later why. So if you could put up the first one, which is the Entrada, let's just hear that. But just listen very carefully to this opening. And then the second example is going to be an example of a so-called Deutsches Lied from the middle of the 18th century, which so that you can hear what the lead used to sound like before Schubert. Well, it's an interesting history of this little piece because no one really knew it. Or we don't know if people knew it in the 18th century in Vienna, but it emerged later in the 19th century. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know about this little piece. But it interests me because it starts by sounding like the Eroica symphony. Like that. And then the lead, which follows, is a very simple song sung by Bastien in F major. And it has lots of pastoral. Now, can we have the second example?
Yes.
Okay. Let's hear this now. Good, thank you. It's very simple fifth harmony, plus this at the start. I would like to propose, although I can't prove it, let's suppose that Beethoven actually did know this piece. A lot of people have talked about the resemblance, obviously I'm not the first one, of the opening of the overture to the opening of the Eroica symphony. And the general argument is it's such an arpeggio thing, lots of people use this in overtures, but if you listen to it, and then think of the Eroica. I've looked in the literature for something else that Beethoven might have think, but this is the only, and people have taken dance tunes and so forth. For me, the resemblance is actually too exact, and it's not only this, but it's also how it goes on. And that, plus the fact that in this little aria that opens the opera, you've got this kind of sound. When you think of the last movement of the Eroica symphony, now, what could there be a connection between these two things? What is this little opera about? Well, it's about two people who are actually in love, but through a lot of misunderstandings in the village in which they live, they have to be brought back together again by this, he's a kind of magician, but he's actually a very sensible therapist. And the basic message of the opera is that this is about requited love, Gegenliebe. And the thing that's staring me in the face, and I think needs a little bit more talking about, is that the Little Mozart opera is also a parody of an opera by Jean-Jacques Rousseau called Le Devin du Village, the sorcerer of the soothsayer, rather, the soothsayer of the village, which was a little opera he wrote in 1753 and became hugely popular in Europe. What has this got to do with the lead? And what has it got to do with the social implications of the lead? Well, I'll try and sum it up. By the time Mozart's opera was composed, Rousseau is extremely famous in Europe as a writer, philosopher, who proposed quite a few things about the nature of human existence in the belief that we're all good and that he didn't believe in the original man, in the forest man. He thought we were all good and we need to grow up understanding that we are, our connection with nature, and we need to be educated to try and prevent us going downhill. And he invented something like the general will that it's possible in a society to achieve this state. It's full of problems, of course, because if we're all good, how does evil come into the world in the first place? Big discussion. The other thing, if we're going to have a society, who is going to make sure that we're all together in the society? What does the general will mean? And how is it going to be instrumental? Police, politicians, and so forth. This is big stuff. And this is not surprising that the French revolutionists took Rousseau to their hearts. And Robespierre was a great enthusiast. I'm not saying he understood him that well. And he was the one who instigated the bringing of Rousseau's ashes to Paris. So he's now in the Pantheon with the rest. That's 1794. Of course, Robespierre in 1794, this is the period of the Terror, which horrified Beethoven and many other people in Europe. So these two things about the benign view of humanity and the idea that Robespierre was an enthusiast of Rousseau, a very peculiar combination of circumstances. Just a little bit more on the Mozart. The manuscript, I can't prove this, it's now in Krakow, but because Mozart wrote it in Vienna, on the commission from Mesmer, you know, the Mesmer of mesmerism, I don't think it's beyond the possibilities that Beethoven managed to get an insight into this manuscript. And of course, he knew immediately about the connection to Rousseau. So the question then is, and I know I'm extrapolating here and I can't prove it, this is just a proposition for discussion. Is the Eroica symphony, is there a reason why this opera is quoted at the start, if it is a quote? Because this, as we all know, the Eroica symphony is about heroism. It was dedicated to Napoleon originally. The story is that Beethoven got infuriated that Napoleon had crowned himself, tore out the dedication. Whether or not that's true has been discussed. The truth is, though, that at that time in Vienna, when the Viennese were falling out with Paris, 1803, 1804, it was very, very difficult to dedicate a symphony to Napoleon anyway, because you simply couldn't do it because of the coalition that was gathering against Napoleon in Paris. That's a political reason. But what if we look at it in a broader sense, which people have sensibly done? This is, you know, a work about heroism in a larger scale. It's also about the death of a hero, and hence the second movement, which Beethoven said. It's also a journey from the first movement to the last movement, which is borrowing from a ballet he did in Prometheus, and it includes an English dance with this bass. So it rather looks like that this, if it is about heroism, it's about the trials of the hero in the first movement, the death of the hero in the second, the scherzo, and then the final movement where finally everybody is coming together in nature. And also because of the controversy about Rousseau, it's understandable that Beethoven would get annoyed with Napoleon for crowning himself, because one of the controversies about Rousseau was this is all very well to talk about the general will and general harmony, but if the people who are trying to bring everybody together actually go wrong themselves, then we have a problem. So the myth that he tore out the dedication may have some truth to it. Now, can we just hear the opening of the Eroica Symphony, and then we'll hear a bit of the last movement.
Now.
John Elliott Garden, very fast. Good. And now the last movement. Good, thank you. I think scholars are agreed that that little tune you just heard is basically the idea of an English dance, which was very popular in France and in Germany, incidentally, and certainly in Austria. The idea of the English dance is that we come together, dance together in harmony, and above all, in nature. Just to remind everybody that in Vienna, when Beethoven first went there, and certainly in the first 15 or so years, English gardens were very popular. Why were they popular? Because they weren't French. The French gardens were too civilized. The English gardens, however, full of wayward paths, usually a little temple in the middle. There are plenty of these examples in England. Gives nature back to itself, so to speak. So the ideal for Beethoven, I'm guessing now, would be to have the Eroica Symphony somehow performed in an English garden. Of course, it was performed in a rather small room in the Lobkowitz Palace, but that's, you know, another matter. Now, if we have on the one hand the lead, which is all about simple emotions expressed in a rather artless way, which I think that tune is not, I'm not talking about the way Beethoven handles it, but the nature of the tune. That on the one hand. And we have on the other hand a symphony in which this finds itself, and which there's a... How do these things actually come together? Because what we're talking about with the Deutsches Lied, and this is what the little Mozart opera, and indeed Rousseau's opera is about, it's about relationships on a private, quasi half-public scale, but something that happens privately, is in harmony, that influences the outside. How does technically this work? And one of the things I want to just point out before we get on to Schubert, because I think Schubert learned a thing or two from this symphony and many other works by Beethoven. If we think about the Why is that there? This is one of the most talked about passages, most written about passages in the history of music. In fact, a favorite exam question. I've never set it myself, but some of my colleagues have. What happens to the D flat in the first movement of the Eroica? Big story. Etc. The point is that this little chromatic thing, and also, by the way, this here, the E natural, I mean, they have very important structural implications later on in the movement. As far as the E natural is concerned, that key of E minor, which Beethoven arrives at quite by surprise in the middle of the movement. That's also, by the way, a pretty daring move, moving chromatically from E flat to E minor, so in the chord like this. We'll see later that Schubert actually does this in his songs as well, where the tonality on the smaller level becomes actually really quite complex to analyze. Now, having said all that, before I go on about these technical ways that composers reconcile the symphonic structures with the private aspects of what they're trying to do, I think I'm putting myself on a limb here. I think Beethoven really invented the idea of the symphony as embodying both the private and the public. And this needs to be discussed in terms of the reception of Beethoven, obviously. For example, if we're talking about Gegenliebe, requited love, which is the point of Mozart's opera, it really is quite important to note here that this little called Gegenliebe. It comes from a Doppellied, so I didn't play it quite accurately. But it becomes, that part of it is included in the choral fantasy. In fact, the last part of the choral fantasy are variations on that theme. And as you can hear, it's the origin of the famous tune at the end of the Ninth Symphony. And people have said, oh, how interesting that he should take this song in 1797, called Gegenliebe. Seufze eines Ungeliebten is the first lead, the sighs of someone who is not loved, and then this it's not a coincidence. Of course it's not a coincidence, because the message of the choral fantasia at the end of that long concert, after the divine artist appears, after the Benedictus plays his improvisation, and then introduces at the piano Kirill. This is the pianist as the divine hero bringing society together. That should be included into the Ninth Symphony, which is one of his most famous pieces, and which has this ambition as well. This is not chance, in my view. So here, in this instance, we see how the lead, something that starts at the lead, becomes something really quite massive and public. Now, before going on a bit further, I think we ought to have a look, as the Eroica Symphony has been talked about in the context of Napoleon so often. Taking away the dedication certainly didn't mean that he lost interest in Napoleon, by the way. I think that's a fairly established fact. He continued taking an interest in Napoleon after that. So, because he has been associated, and he compared himself to Napoleon, let's have a look at what the Napoleonic hero must have. I put these together. These are fairly casual things that one can find in the literature and so forth, but I think they can be summed up fairly like this, and we can go on to discuss each one. The first thing, that the hero must have intelligence and charisma. The second thing is there has to be no doubt about integrity. In fact, Beethoven has been accused of being too virtuous in his music, of wagging the finger at the audience and saying, "Thou shalt be moral," and so forth. The important thing, though, for Beethoven and for Napoleon is you move towards the light. You don't move towards darkness. You move towards the triumphant ending, as in the choral fantasia and also in the Eroica symphony, and of course in the which is a kind of battle between good and evil before we get, after this long journey, to the light of C major at the end. 3, steadfastness, inner strength towards greatness. There's no doubt that Beethoven thought he was a great person. He wasn't modest in that respect. 4, this is quite important, I think, the desire to save authority. That is to say, the outsider called upon by destiny. And one of the important things about Beethoven, and I'm writing about this in some detail, is that in some ways he belongs to this mainly 19th century trope of the man from the provinces who comes to town and does good. You know, these Hollywood films, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and so forth. And the point about this is that Rousseau was one of the first to become part of this model. Napoleon himself, who came from the provinces, minor nobility and all of that. But they come to the big town, Beethoven from Bonn, in order to assert their authenticity from outside. They don't bother to dress like everybody in charge. Everybody knows that Rousseau dressed very casually. Certainly Beethoven retained his Rhenish dress. He refused to wear wigs and court clothes and so forth like that. Also, you feel that you are better than the big city because you've got something to offer, and indeed they probably have. So in a way, there is this myth about the man from the provinces, which Beethoven actually encouraged a little bit in Vienna, which is why we hear so little now about his time in Bonn. There's some wonderful people in Vienna doing a lot of research on this, I'm glad to say. So this hole in our knowledge of Beethoven, I think, is going to be filled, although it's very, very tricky, as I know from Wagner, if you bring in the composer himself encouraging this idea. 5, a willed and necessary course becomes the fate of companions. So what you are doing, you feel not only responsible for yourself, but for the fate of the people you are composing for. This has been given lots of big phrases. Karl Dahlhaus used to compare it to the Roman Forum, where the composer is talking to big crowds. I don't think that's necessarily a good comparison, but it's basically a moral stance that you have got some kind of insight and that you can help your contemporaries in this respect. And 6, which I've already mentioned, this belief in virtue, that you have to be virtuous. This was, of course, one of Robespierre's big things, the whole issue of virtue in the French Revolution. But of course, it went all wrong, which is why Beethoven actually was against the Jacobin version of the French Revolution. Fidelio is not really about the Jacobin, it's about virtue in a different sense. That's a different subject, but it does involve a reconciliation in some form of the public and private. If we could just see the next slide, which is the final 7th. Above all, this kind of hero must have the sense that the work of the hero is inevitable. That is to say, it represents the work of destiny, which is why a lot of Beethoven's works have a kind of inevitable feel about them. In fact, they feel as if they've been there all the time, don't they? I remember Michael Steinberg, a wonderful dramaturg of the Boston Symphony, said, you know, he wrote this in 1976. The problem with Beethoven is that it's so familiar. It's like one of those journeys that you commute every day and you see the stations going by and you're suffering on your long commute, but you see the stations, you know you're getting to the end. And every day you see them, it's a wonderful reassurance. That isn't how you should really perform Beethoven, actually, because the idea of inevitability can become written in stone and become something unlively. And I think that, to a certain extent, is happening in this Beethoven year. It's too much we know everything about him, and these things are inevitable. That is not good for Beethoven. Right, now let's move on to a different kind of hero. I'll discuss all this a bit more later. Could we have the next slide? Now, this is another kind of hero called the Byronic hero. Now, Byron, as we know, didn't come to the attention of the European intelligentsia until much later. In Germany, and I think this has still got to be emphasized, he was hugely influential, as well as in France and, of course, in England. Ironically, because he left England for Italy. And after he'd published Childe Harold at the beginning of the 1810s, then went on to write Manfred, there came to be a kind of Byron, Lord Byron cult in Europe, and certainly in Germany, which put together a really very different kind of hero, which was in essence a rebellion against the Napoleonic version. And if we list these characteristics, again, very crudely and generally, we find things between the two. We find, for example, intelligence, but this time sophistication is very important for the hero to have. There is, though, a struggle with integrity. Am I sure about my moral values? The flight into nature doesn't mean that you're somehow coming together with Gegenliebe necessarily, requited love or good relations. It means you're going into darkness often, that this is actually a problem. You're prone to mood swings, hallucinations, visions, that's number 3. You have a disrespect for authority and you become an outcast, you become an outsider. And that is a virtue. With Beethoven, although people say he was a bit of an outcast himself, I don't think this was Beethoven's intention at all. I think this is something of a myth. 5, a tendency to be cynical and self-destructive. Some people would say Beethoven was like this. I don't agree. I think he was outrageously enthusiastic right to the end. I don't know why, because he suffered so much, but this is actually a contrast with the Byronic hero, and Beethoven didn't have much interest in this anyway. 6, mysterious sexuality, which leads to trouble. You can see where I'm leading here. Can I have number 7? Above all, the hero, the Byronic hero, must have the sense, instead of it being inevitable for die Ewigkeit, little time left. Now, that's a very broad summary, I know, and there are common factors with the Napoleonic kind of hero. But the point I want to make here is I'm going to show this now in a film clip from 1936, a film made by Abel Gance, is that somehow the image of the Byronic hero has got back projected on to Beethoven. And I just want you to watch this film. This is by a man who made a very important film in film history. Actually, I don't think it's a terribly good film, on Napoleon in the 1920s and 1927, with lots of advanced technology, had 3 screens, there's an orchestra, it's done occasionally. It's always a big event for film buffs. So it's not surprising that in 1936, in Paris, he should want to make a film about Beethoven, because he thought of the two things clearly together. Now, this scene is completely invented. It never happened in Beethoven's life, but basically it's about the wedding of Giulietta Guicciardi, who is marrying another composer, but Beethoven was not pleased. I think this is probably true. He was in love with her. He taught her the piano. He dedicated the Moonlight Sonata to her. Talk about that in a minute. In this scene, he gets somehow into Giulietta Guicciardi's wedding and locks himself in the organ loft. Much to everybody's horror, no one can get out. So he's not locked down, he's locked in. And we hear him playing a piece, which you'll recognize, no doubt. And you will see Guicciardi, Giulietta, looking up and saying, Musik de mort. It's the music of death. Let's just play the clip.
Oh, vraiment? Il vaut mieux que ça vaille comme ça.
Cette musique.
Cette marche nuptiale est une plaisanterie. Macabre, voulez-vous dire?
Tu le comptes, c'est M. Beethoven qui talente. Il s'est enfermé à clé. Tâchez d'aller jusqu'à lui. Je vais essayer.
Je ne puis arriver à comprendre.
Puisque je le répète que Ludwig a acheté l'organiste.
Chez Marion.
Oui, pour prendre sa place alors.
Oh, mon Dieu!
Quel scandale!
C'est cette musique de mort.
It's a bit jerky, but I think you got the point.
Yes, I think.
What did you think of that?
The video transmission is what it is in these shared video.
It doesn't matter. I think it was clear, wasn't it?
Yes,
now,
we get the idea.
First of all, you have this funeral march from the Opus 26. Sorry, Marcel Dupré is playing at a different key. It's his arrangement for the film. Kind of blown up from a private piano sonata. Don't forget, Beethoven's piano sonatas were, like the Lieder, were relatively private matters. I can't remember a single piano recital in Vienna in those days. And if you look at first performances of the piano sonata, they're really, really difficult to come because there really aren't any public ones. So we have this curious already Viennese mixture of the public and private, which I think had an influence on the compositions. But the most important thing is that by being in lockdown or locked in like that, Beethoven is not exactly going out into the public. He's internalizing himself. There's a feeling that there's very little time left because what happens in the film, that there's an increasing sense of panic. He also wants to be saved by a woman. That's Therese von Brunswick, who comes in the end. She was a candidate for the Immortal Beloved, but she can't do anything about it. There's lots of knocking on the door. He refuses to come out. He's clearly thinking about it, but this is not the Napoleonic hero. It is much more the Byronic hero that doesn't really belong to Beethoven, in my view. That's one aspect of it. The fact that it never happened in Beethoven's life doesn't really matter here. It's what Abel Gance, I think, is trying to express in view of what people thought of Beethoven in 1936. But let's move now to Schubert. How does this idea of the Byronic hero fit his work? If we go back to Gretchen am Spinnrad, a very ambitious piece composed in 1814. 1814 was the moment in Europe when this whole idea of Byron, the rebel, of going on journeys away from your home, of seeing your home country in a completely different way, of having a problematic relationship to nature, your own self, and even about death and sin and so forth. What is the connection here? Well, let's show a nice picture of somebody. Nice face. Now, this is Wilhelm Müller, who is the author of the text of Winterreise. And it's not generally well known, I think it ought to be better known, that Müller was an expert on Byron. And when Schubert read his poems and knew that they were coming out, he more or less dropped everything to compose Winterreise, Schöne Müllerin, etc. And I think the attraction was because, I'm not saying this is necessarily how Schubert lived his personal life. I'm saying that he actually agreed more, shall we say, with the Byronic idea of the hero rather than the Neapolitan one. Of course, we have to be careful here because in the reception of Schubert, to begin with, his Lieder were much better known than his symphonic works. But as time went on and Schumann discovered the great C major and the unfinished symphony, which was discovered belatedly, wasn't performed till 1865, we can see a new kind of symphonism in Schubert. I think he's a great symphonist, by the way, which tries to combine this intimate, lyrical, you might want to call it short-breathed sense of atmosphere and state of mind with symphonic structures. That's also true of things like the B-flat major piano sonata, the late one, Notice that E natural there. That begins artlessly, like an 18th century lead. But then, my God, does it go through an incredible series of modulations. And that piece in particular, I'm saying this because I'm sure you play it, Kirill, perhaps you can comment on this, it needs space to expand. Because there are two things at work here. There's this intense lyricism that works from the inside, and there's also the sense of the journey being much more complicated than it would be, even more complicated than it would be with Beethoven, although I think there are elements of this in Beethoven as well. So the melancholic aspect of it, this internalization of personal problems against the public thing, and I'm talking aesthetically now, I'm not talking about the biography necessarily. The way this leads to what musicologists have called, rather unfortunately, deviant musical procedures. They're not deviant at all. They're basically an amalgam of things that have been developing in the history of the lead for a very long time. So I thought it might be quite a good idea to look at now Die Winterreise. If you could bring up the next example. After this very important word, fremd, meaning alien, whatever you like to, becoming an extremely important word these days, but it's certainly an important word in Winterreise, because Müller begins with fremd, mich eingezogen, as an alien, I came, as an alien, I left. The idea of the outsider. The first song is also called Gute Nacht, good night, which gives a sense of this cycle, in the cycle, there not being much time left. You could argue that the singer, or the protagonist, is going slightly crazy. And I know Tom Addis was on last week. I saw a wonderful performance with Simon Keenlyside in Vienna last November, where Simon Keenlyside came on, not dressed in white tie or anything like that, but looking really almost demented. It was a wonderful performance, particularly when he grabbed the piano as if he was basically getting very shaky. It's also a journey. So the emphasis, I would argue, is not only on the Winter, but on the Reise, the fact that this is a journey possibly to nowhere. Also today, I think this is why a lot of films with journeys in them, like Mad Max Fury Road, I don't know whether you know that one, or Snowpiercer, where you're enclosed in a space like this as if it's your house, but you're journeying through these alien landscapes. This is, I think, something that really catches the idea of what it means to be in a society where you are locked in, but when you go on a journey, there's something very anxious about it. I have been going outside recently. I get nervous simply going outside now because I'm not used to doing it. But I don't want to talk about me. Let's have a look at the beginning of Winterreise, if you just get that one up. Let's just play the example. We just need the first stroke. This is, by the way, an older recording of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, I think it was 1948, where his later recordings are too healthy. He sounds really very fit. In this early one, it's much more sensitive. There's a kind of, I'm singing on a precipice. Okay.
Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus. Der Mai war mir gewogen mit manchem Blumenstrauß. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von Ehe. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter.
Ja. Der Mai war mir gewogen. You know, he's already saying there, I think he has a problematic relationship to nature, as Byronic heroes tend to do. Sorry, that's a slightly flat, that recording, but this is my D minor here in Cambridge. This sense of a plodding journey. Also, how Schubert in this little song at the beginning changes the insides of the chord all the time. Simply from major to minor. Like that. Very simple changes inside the musical sound, which makes it have a different kind of resonance to a kind of forward-looking symphonic way of composing. Now, I think this is actually quite an important aspect of Schubert's writing, not only in his symphonic music, of course, but certainly in the Lied, in which has made these such extraordinary pieces. They aren't without precedent, and I think the precedent for them is to be found in theatre, where you can write arias that create moods, where the music is not necessarily logical, where if you want to do a Schenkerian analysis, you get your knickers in a twist, as we say, because it simply won't work so easily. Many analysts have been very ingenious about this, incidentally. Larry Kramer in America has done some marvelous analyses of Schubert songs. But it's very, very difficult to grasp these small variations inside chords, the way the tonalities don't quite fit together. But the sense of the journey is what I want to emphasize here. And perhaps we can now move to the next example, which is, can we have that up? Yeah. Right, let's hear it. Yes, urgency also, we've got this. Got these harmonies that keep repeating themselves. The Opus 1, this is Opus 1, first published work. Schubert lay a great deal of stress on it. It's a very ambitious work. Again, he wasn't actually modest, I don't think, although he has a reputation of precisely not being the young man from the provinces who comes to Vienna. He's already there. He doesn't need the pretensions of flaunting his authenticity around, because he already is, in his view, probably more Viennese than any visitor who'd like to come and correct what the Viennese do. Just think about that. But what is it about? Well, it's about the Erlkönig, and it's about a father and it's about a son. And the urgency is that the son is ill. We're not quite sure where the father is taking him. But just before we get to the end, the son starts saying he's got a vision of the Erlkönig, who is this rather evil kind of figure from the fairy tale. It's a kind of vision, and the father says, it's okay, it's okay. And the song ends with the death of the son. Now, I think, could we just move on to the next one? That's right. I want to play straight away the beginning of Die Walküre by Wagner. Let's just play it. If we do it. These similar sonorities. What is this piece about? Well, it's about a father and son. What is it? It's a journey. It's a journey through bad weather, just like the Erlkönig. And it's given expression in the music, just as Schubert gives in the music. It's also not only about a father leading the son to where the sword is that's supposed to save humanity. It's also about the failure of the journey, because the hero, in this case Siegmund, the mortal hero created by a god, dies, just like the boy dies at the end of the Erlkönig. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that we have add plus this kind of business. But again, like the Gans film, this is music that starts as the lead, but translated into much broader mythic operatic spaces. And I mention this because I think, generally speaking, the influence of Schubert on Wagner has not been properly recognized. Because when you think about it, what Wagner's works are, particularly The Ring and Tristan, these are symphonically conceived operas, but are also full of very intimate moments indeed, lyrical moments with marvelous senses of harmony that can be related to the way Schubert also manipulated harmony. Nietzsche used to call Wagner derogatorily a miniaturist. In some ways, he was right about that, because Wagner's works are full of very, very intimate moments. And I just want to make a comparison before I move on further to Tristan, with which I'll finish, between one of Schubert's most marvelous, famous songs. We've had Opus 2, which is Gretchen am Spinrad. I've had Opus 1. This is Opus 3, number 2. This is a song called Meeresstille. And I just want you to hear this, first of all. Quite contrary to this, this is a song that's so placid. It's all about someone contemplating still water, but afraid of what is underneath it. But just listen to Brigitte Fassbender sing this. she's singing it in the wrong key in B flat. That doesn't matter. Just let's hear it. Okay, is that wonderful song? Very difficult to do though. Let's have the next example. This is Christa Ludwig singing a passage. Okay, from That's, by the way, from the Herbert von Karajan recording, not the Shorty, when I accidentally put the wrong one up there. Now, that is a marvelously sung passage. I talked to Christa Ludwig, not so, she's a wonderfully lively person, about Waldschauter, and she said, ja, das ist eine Grüne. So we could have a long discussion about that. But Christa Ludwig is also talking about water here and about throwing the ring back into the peace and the placidness of the bottom of the Rhine. And of course, it's very disturbed music, but it also has this wonderful way of elaborating chords from the inside. In the Meeresstille, for example, at things like this, Luft von keiner Seite. der ungeheuren. Well, you don't really know. It ends in C major. It was B flat when Fassbender sung it. But you don't know that that piece is actually in C major because it keeps wandering inside chords right through, paradoxically to create this idea of stillness. And here. Inside that chord, as she is singing, we have more dissonant than Schubert, probably, but the principle is the same thing. Now, I want to get on to Tristan and Isolde, which I think is a piece by Wagner that's been most influenced by the Lied. Not just Schubert's, but about the idea of the Lied. And this is why I think he wrote concurrently the Wesendonck Lieder. Now, we have to remember that Wagner was not in the habit of writing Lieder at this period in his life, but he went out of his way to get his friend, Mathilde Wesendonck, to write the text of these 5 pieces. A lot of it has been made about this, about their so-called affair between one another, but I think actually there was a compositional reason for this. Wagner wanted to study how it was writing a Lied in the Schubertian sense of something entirely internalized in a vast structure, which in itself is starting with a journey over water and turns out to be something about very unstable internal relations in contradistinction to a court that's been there for a long, long time and the rebellion of these internal relations to the court of King Mark and so forth. So to get away into this, I've discovered that in 1855, Franz Liszt, bless his socks, who by the way wrote marvelous Lieder himself, wrote an article on a German composer called Robert Franz. And I think he did it as a compliment to Franz because everybody liked Robert Franz, but he was in really difficult circumstances. But what's interesting is that, I'll say what he says in a minute, but just to say that not long later, just before starting the composition of Tristan, Richard Wagner made a point of inviting Robert Franz to his house in Zurich. And Robert Franz himself says, Wagner opened his cupboard of music and he showed me Bach, Beethoven, Schubert, and all the greats, and the Lieder of Robert Franz. And obviously, Wagner wanted to play some of these with Franz, and he says that he sang the part. Wagner had not a bad tenor voice, sang them, and Franz did the accompaniment. Now, why should he be wanting to get to know the Lieder of Robert Franz at this stage? And I think it has quite a lot to do with this article, which he must have known. It was in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik. They all read this. And also, above all, it's about what Franz Liszt says about the Lieder of Robert Franz. For example, the Lieder enter a new phase. I'll just mention 3 of the things. Moods that are deeply self-absorbed, Stimmungen, die sich in sich vertiefen. That's Liszt German. Number 2, pain is transformed into a feeling of blissful dying away, ein Gefühl seligen Sich-Verlierens. And number 3, subsidiary modulations, Nebenmodulationen, surge into the smallest, most secret layers of feeling. Now, if you know Robert Franz's songs, it's actually very difficult. I've got one here, for example. It's called Träume. Very straightforward harmonies, not like the Träume of Richard Wagner in the Wesendonck-Lieder. I don't need to play the rest, but you can hear exactly this Schubertian method of moving inside the chords as if to internalize it and also to give it strength in and of itself from these semitonal movements. So if we could have the next slide, my argument bit proposed, is Liszt really writing about Franz Schubert here? Because every one of his descriptions of Robert Franz's Lieder are meant to flatter Franz, but the Lieder themselves don't really live up to what he's saying, but the Lieder of Franz Schubert do. So if you, well, to take another example from the Wesendonck-Lieder, if you have something like this, for example, incidentally, it's that chord again. Remember it? Transposed in the opera ingeniously by Wagner to this. Because he wants the low G, that hollow sound on the open string on the violins. That's another example of how Wagner is using a Schubertian method to sort of hype up the internal subjective energy of these passages. And I'd like to end with a final example, which is none other than the Liebestod. If you could put that up, Kirill, quickly. Oops, is it there? There we go. I'll do it in English first. One of the things about Robert Franz, and it may be that Wagner knew the poet Nicholas Lenau through Robert Franz. Robert Franz set a lot of the poems of Lenau. Professor Riethmüller, a famous musicologist in Berlin, pointed out to me several years ago that there looks to be a very striking resemblance between one of Lenau's poems about Beethoven, called the Beethoven Büste, and Wagner's Tristan, the Verklärung of Isolde. And the text is right there. He's published a little bit about this. Let's have it in German. Let's have the next slide, because I think you can see it more easily. Sanftes Wogen, heller Schallen, holdes Rieseln, sind es Welsfeld, kühle Wellen, and so forth. If you look down these columns, you can see wie sie steigen, wie sie schwellen. You can see sind es Wogen, sanftes Wogen. You can see similar resemblances in the language. And it occurs at this marvelous moment just when the music is coming to this most symphonic aspect. Now, I'm interested in this because if this comparison makes any sense, if you compare it with an essay Wagner wrote about Beethoven, this is the Beethoven who is sleepwalking. He's like a sleepwalker. He saw him as a prophet of the future, present in our dreams and so forth. This is the symphonic Beethoven being transformed via something that could have been a lead. And in fact, the Liebestod is, in my view, a lead. It's a symphonic lead. that makes this symphonic ambition plus the internalized Schubertian, shall we say, rising of tension, makes a lot of sense. And this is really the climax, I think, of Wagner's contribution to this very interesting confrontation between the Lied and the symphony in the 19th century. So that's it. We can have a little example if you want. I've got Waltraud Meyer singing it, but I think everybody knows it.
Yes, well, yes, and we should re-listen to that in full. Well, first of all, thank you, John, and an amazing presentation of a very striking and I think very convincing argument. And I was struck originally when you said Schubert and Wagner, because indeed that is not the combination that one hears so explored. And perhaps to start off, before we also turn to questions from our participants, why do you think that is historically, that we're so focused or perhaps over-concentrated on the Beethoven-Wagner relationship, and that the Schubert-Wagner relationship has been so relatively overlooked?
I think the first answer to that question is that Wagner himself wanted to create the image, I come from Beethoven. Not necessarily that he musically did. The ambition, I think, not the musical detail is obviously, he wrote about it. He wrote a big essay in 1870, and he was always mentioning it. One of the very first things he does, biographically speaking, is do an arrangement of the Ninth Symphony for piano, which he often shot, by the way. Talk about composers being adventurous, but he was too young. So there is this theme in his own writings that have influenced the discourse a great deal. Schubert does come in sort of a way in an essay he wrote about German music and the authenticity of German music for Paris, where he posits a family, and it could be the Schubert family, you know, in that big family they had in the school, where the people are sitting around the table writing authentic string quartets, as opposed to the commercially, the dastard commercially influenced music of Paris. So we have to, you know, get rid of that and go back to the German spirit. And strangely enough, it's an essay in which he praises Meyerbeer as someone who's come to Paris to try and help this. He had to scrub that bit out later on. But I think that's one of the reasons. And I also think that this big ambition of Wagner's in his works, let's call it the symphonic, dramatic ambition, and the Beethoven symphonies have drawn attention. I don't think there's much discussion sensible about the relationship between Beethoven symphonies, but the idea of the two people as figureheads together, I think, has been for that reason. Whereas Schubert, who in many ways is far more interesting because of these, shall we say, Byronic contradictions, has been neglected on a number of fronts, not just this one. It's getting better now, I think, but there's a lot of really weird stuff, him about being a deviant composer, compositionally, which may be or may not be true, and then sort of deviant in his own life. I mean, it's really a conflation between the biographical and things. So all of this has got in the way. And because people are genuinely moved by Schubert, I find the music quite marvelous. But looking at it technically and looking at to see things of content which you can get through technical analysis and so forth, this has been a much more difficult journey. And often it gets so technical that people in the public sphere can't even read it. So we've got a lot of work to do here, I think.
And certainly you're doing it. Do we know, I mean, would it be correct to say that in some way Beethoven has always loomed large in the entire 19th and 20th century, but Schubert in many ways kind of had a downward slope in his popularity at first, at least in some ways. So do we know how Wagner would have known Schubert's songs? Is it also through Franz Liszt, or is it?
No. I think
known enough?
No, I think this is also a misconception. I think when he died, Schubert was quite well known. Certainly in Vienna, that's why he was buried in the Währinger cemetery, just almost adjacent to Beethoven. I mean, this was really a quite high-class cemetery. He must have been a person of standing. But the truth is, as always in music history, it's about economics and it's about publishing. It's about very boring, unaesthetic things. There are about 40+% of Schubert's work were published, but they were Lieder, most of all. A lot of the Lieder were very well known. And that means that the generation coming after Beethoven studied these. Everybody did. Mendelssohn, Schumann, Liszt certainly, and Wagner. If you were a musician of any sort and wanted to make a contribution to German music, which of course Schubert was perceived to be doing, of course the Deutsches Lied, the German art song and so forth, you could not miss him. Even in Paris, they were performing the Lieder of Schubert. It's just that the symphonic works, the bigger works, they, as I've already mentioned, they came later. So the full picture of Schubert's contribution is belated, but he wasn't neglected quite as much as we think. In fact, the Schumann correspondence with Robert Franz, for example, because he was very friendly with Robert, mentioned Schubert all the time. And as you know, you probably play some of the Liszt arrangements of the Schubert Lieder, the Erlkönig. There's even one of Meeresstille, isn't there? And there are things like Die Stadt, where you've got basically C minor turned into a diminished tempo, and that's it. There isn't. That's all it is. You're not even sure if it's in C minor by the time you get to that. And of course, this is a gift to someone of Liszt's talents, and this much greater freedom with the way you can handle form via the details of the chords, for example.
And there is a question from actually one of our students, an excellent pianist, Alexander Gadzhiev, saying, don't you think that Liszt himself influenced to a great extent the harmonic language of Wagner as well? And to maybe extend that question with something that you already just mentioned earlier, the influence of Liszt's own Lieder, specifically Lieder, not just the harmonic language that we know was very influential on Wagner. Do you see that as an element in Wagner's operas?
This is really quite a difficult question. I think as far as the harmonic influence of Liszt on Wagner, I think this is a myth. I think if it's the other way around. I think when Liszt got to know Wagner's works very well, his harmonic language changed. What Wagner found interesting in Liszt was the idea of symphonic form, the symphonic poems. There's a song by Liszt, isn't there, with something in it that looks very much like the Tristan chord. And everybody's taken that. It's old news now, actually, in scholarship, to mean that, Liszt invented the Tristan chord. But if you look at the earlier versions of this song, that isn't there. This is another version that was composed after Liszt became acquainted with Tristan, and he inserted it into the song more or less as a homage. You find, by the way, Liszt and Wagner citing each other. There's a passage like that in the Valkyrie that's obviously taken from Liszt's Faust Symphony. In turn, the Faust Symphony was an idea of Wagner's originally, and in the Faust Symphony, Liszt cites Wagner in the second song. Ta-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da. That's the second subject of the Faust overture. So the relationship is sort of like this. But the harmonic influence, I think Wagner knew far more about harmony than Liszt did, actually. And by the way, he was quite a well-trained composer. He understates this studying of composition earlier in his life because he wants to come across as a kind of Siegfried, I think, without proper tuition. No, he did his counterpoint exercises. You can hear even in this. The part writing in that, I mean, that's someone who's incredibly skilled. And what a difference if you compare it to the model, which is by Marschner. It's an opera called Hans Heiling, very coming out of the world of the Elbkönig. This is much more interesting. It also starts interesting like this. You think that's going to G minor, but instead it goes to F sharp minor. Go from there to there. That's a classic Schubertian maneuver where you just change the tonality. And it happens in the instrumental works, as you know, too.
That's very interesting. So that really is then more of a myth propagated that, oh.
I think it's a bit of a myth about it, but you know, I want to defend Wagner here because the idea of Liszt taking credit for Wagner's incredible harmonic genius, a lot of it is, it's not about alignment, it's about this wonderful sense of harmony. I just feel that it's not quite right, although I understand where it comes from.
And where do you think comes the this, as you suggest, a false turning of Beethoven into a Byronic hero? Is that actually generated by somebody like Wagner and Liszt for their purposes?
Yes, he turns into the sleepwalking Byronic Fremde, you know, whatever. Yes, this comes from the Romantic generation afterwards that sort of reinterpreted him. But one thing that's, I think that's fairly clear. The French even co-opted Beethoven as one of their own. That's what's so interesting about the Gans film, by the way, that by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, Beethoven is such an important composer for the French that you think he's probably French. So he sees the people speaking French in that film extract. In the rest of the film, which is not a good film, by the way, Beethoven speaks French, and it's kind of appropriate. But I think more interesting for me is what Schubert got from Beethoven, because there is this myth that his idea of the Lied, Gretchen am Spinnrad, he kind of invented this. And also the concatenation between the Lied and this great symphony, the public and the private. But Beethoven himself, I think, has these chromatic things inside things. If you take, for example, change of minor. That to me sounds very much like Schubert, because you've got this static, I know it's a funeral march, but you've got this static melody sort of energized from underneath by these subtle chromatic changes, like we've been hearing in Schubert's music. So that's a little bit later in the Seventh Symphony, but also earlier on in things like the Moonlight Sonata, which of course Schubert knew. And the Moonlight Sonata, a model for Chopin, of course the whole of Chopin is in the Moonlight Sonata. But the difference, I think, with Beethoven, sorry, that's Freud, that slip, is that Beethoven works out in a far more rigorous way the relationship between these static moments, like the one I just played from the Seventh Symphony, and the larger symphonic structure. With Schubert, it's far looser. Adorno used to say, and I think he got this from Edward Steuermann, a famous pianist. I think he was in Berlin. Steuermann played him the Opus 90 of Schubert, the impromptus. And they both asked him, why does this music sound so melancholic? Why does it sound much more melancholic than anything by Beethoven? More internalized, more sort of unmoored. And they came to the conclusion it was because the details of the harmony weren't so much fixed, the tonalities, to the idea of the whole form, whereas in Beethoven, they tend to be far more worked out. You could argue that this is the moral aspect of the Napoleonic hero, this idea of rigor. And I think Schubert has been accused, actually, he was accused in his own life, we'll never have a Beethoven or a Haydn out of Schubert, because people perceive this as a technical weakness, whereas we can see now that it's a technical strength more than a weakness. It's hugely ingenious. And it's something I think that Schubert really worked at as well, because this is not something that you can, he's a very fast composer, but this is not something you do not think about. It's too systematically done.
Mm.
I mean the laxness of the relationship, not the Strenge,
Yeah, and
that makes sense. I mean, it's
no, very much so. I think so. And if it isn't, people should ask follow-up questions in the chat that I'm looking at as we speak. In the meantime, well, one sees obviously the great importance and in some way the great cachet that even these great composers such as Wagner, in some way Liszt, certainly Brahms, place on this relationship to Beethoven. Now we are, as we started at the beginning, we're in some kind of Beethoven anniversary year, but also all the previous years in some way are very much celebrating our relationship to Beethoven. And though this question is sometimes irritating when it pops up in interviews, but what is it, do you think? I'll just pass it on to you because I get this question periodically. What is it that you find in Beethoven holds and has held our attention so bound to his figure, one that seems to be also misinterpreted as a Byronic one, and certainly to his music?
Well, I think that his music gives a feeling of assurance and also inner freedom. There's something people used to say about Beethoven, this is quite interesting, that when he played, it wasn't the Lisztian way of playing, he was incredibly calm. Even when he was playing really, activating music, he had this kind of inner calmness. And when you listen to, the slow movement of the Fifth Piano Concerto, for example, you think, where does this come from? I mean, and it's quite different to anything Mozart or Haydn did. There's that, first of all. And there is also the idea that the music seems to have been there all the time, doesn't it? Because it's actually very clear music in some ways. But I think that's also a danger for people. This is why I think the authentic movement, people like Gardner and all the Roger Norrington, they've done a good service actually, because they've shown that Beethoven can be done in different ways. I mean, the disadvantage of the assurance of Beethoven, he gets stuck. People get too much stuck. In fact, I think it's ironic. It's called Beethoven 2020 because 2020 implies perfect vision, doesn't it? I don't think we have perfect vision of Beethoven. There's too much we don't know about him biographically. I don't think we've started talking about some aspects of his music. I'm not saying, by the way, that I agree with John Eliot Gardner and the way Roger Norrington do those music. The issue of tempo, for example, we've still got to talk about that. The interpretation of metronome, why Beethoven bothered to publish those things. There's a lot to talk about that. So I don't want to destabilize Beethoven in any way, but I think he's a more complex person than people tend to think. And he's certainly not this gloomy, Byronic, internalized hero. I mean, right to the very end, people talk about his enthusiasm, even though his deafness was in the way. I don't know how he got to the end of his life in such a good mood. Good, he could be irate like most of us and lose his temper. But basically, I think it's a very positive, outgoing attitude that he had. In his late works, I think, have been misconstrued. Adorno and Thomas Mann cook up this gloomy idea of the late works as somehow critically, fragmented, critique of society. To me, everything comes together in the late. They're like religious epiphanies. There's something hugely positive about them. So I think that we need to talk, and a lot of people have talked about the late works influenced by Adorno's view. And I think people have long since begun to say, hang on a minute, this isn't right. But it's, I think, due to this retrospective, romantic, Byronic, or whatever you like to think about it, imposition, not only on Beethoven biography, but also aesthetically onto the music.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think also so often, because of the several portraits that we know that are where Beethoven looks so angry and ragged, then so many performances have seemingly taken their departure from that. And so if it's a sforzando, it's certainly a stab in the heart.
You've got one question there. What did Beethoven look like? If you look at if you have all the portraits, I've done this actually, I know 17 or whatever, he looks different. Some of them actually taken from life as well. There's a mask that probably gets closer to him. There are no photographs except of his skull. When they disinterred him in Vienna, there's a gruesome picture. That's the only photograph we have of Beethoven. So even what he looked like, let alone what Mozart looked like, that's another issue. There's really quite a lot we don't know, but because we don't know, we like to put lots of things into those spaces, which is fair enough, and I'm probably doing it myself in spades. But this is why he is so fascinating. But there is room for discussion about, especially about performance, and certainly about biography, because there's lots that's still to be said, I think, even though people say, oh no,
I
Not
think
the early period, the Bond period.
I think we should, and we'll come back to Wagner and sort of the main topic of today. But obviously, you are tantalizing on the subject of Beethoven as well. And
yes.
Since you've mentioned the subject of tempi and metronome, I know that I will not be easily forgiven by the interested people listening if I don't ask you something. If I don't ask you to elaborate a little bit more.
What, on the metronomes?
Well, you said the question of tempi, the question of metronomes, and why Beethoven would have bothered publishing them, and so on. What you just
Well, I think my view is that he published them as a corrective, because although he was supposed to be so deaf he couldn't hear anything, he was deaf later on. When was it? 1817 or so. He published that list. A famous list. He could still hear things, and he could tell whether people were doing his music too fast or too slowly. So it's not a question that they seem too fast often. There's that. There's also the way you interpret the metronome. What does it mean? Does it mean clock, clock, clock is 130 or whatever, or does it mean clock, clock, clock?
There's a gentleman on YouTube that plays everything in a double slow tempo.
Yeah. So you can argue several points, but I think the function of them, if that's the question you're asking, I think they were intended as a corrective, which means they could have been deliberately exaggerated just to get people away from their bad habits. Because Wagner had this problem as well, that he found people were playing his music too slowly. All the records show, including rehearsal indications that I put in my new translation of the Ring for Penguin, for example. He's constantly complaining about dragging. And the singers tended to drag because the music is, so emotive. The tendency is to squeeze it the whole time. No. He wanted it much faster because it was dramatically more effective that way. So there are lots of psychological as well as factual things still to talk about, I think, with the metronome question. And I do think it's still important, actually.
Absolutely. And coming back to Wagner and to the opening of your arguments about Beethoven possibly knowing and quoting the early opera of Mozart, of the beginning of Valkyrie and the Erlkönig. How much do you think this was happening by, so to say, by osmosis and just a general field of reference? And how much do you really think these are pointed references and commentaries that are very constructed? So in a sense, is Schubert, do you think, and I understand that there's probably not a definitive answer, but I'm curious about your opinion. Do you think Wagner just says, well, some music that invokes this kind of riding and going, and Erlkönig comes to mind? Or is this really a commentary about...
I think it's a mixture of the two. We talk about types and we talk about certain habits in composition, which is fair enough in the history of music. But talking about the Wagner example, I think you're actually meant to hear the reference. Erlkönig was such a famous piece, that still is, of course, but this was one of Schubert's most famous compositions. In fact, when I first pointed this out, I thought, God, I never heard that before, but I think it seems to be, it's too close for comfort. The Bastien and Bastien problem is more obscure because there's so little evidence, but it's not beyond comprehension because Beethoven knew Baron van Swieten had this enormous manuscript collection in Vienna and who was friends with Mozart, that he, for example, he could have had the manuscript of Bastien in his possession. And of course, he would know that it's meant to be a parody of a piece by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which would have certainly pricked up Beethoven's ears. Also, I think on the subject of Wagner again, I mean, if you are going to look at the Dutchman, for example, D minor, and then da 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 da. Considering Wagner's preoccupation with the Ninth Symphony in Paris when he heard it under Habeneck, it's not, to me, beyond comprehension that that would be a conscious reference to the Beethoven Ninth Symphony and sending the message, I come from Beethoven, even at that early stage. Everybody could hear, of course, that it's not going to sound like Beethoven, but the signal, I think, is something that Wagner would have wanted people to hear. So, given someone of Wagner's consciousness about where he was in history, the same is true of Liszt, by the way, they're very conscious of where they are historically, Schumann as well. If you quote a previous composer or you allude to the previous composer, you're not going to make it egregiously obvious, but you're going to put it there for people to discover. I'm not saying that it's an uncontrovertible fact that the beginning of the Dutchman Overture is taken from the Ninth Symphony, or that the beginning of Valkyrie is taken from the Erlkönig. But in terms of content, procedure, this chord, father, son, storm, wind, and so forth, the coincidence is too much. And that seems to me the case with the opening of the Eroica and the Bastien. Believe you me, I have looked through endless dance volumes. Some people have. Someone said, oh, there's this dance here that's got the da-dee-da, but it's not nowhere near. So it's too close for comfort. No. This is not a coincidence, in my view.
Yes, and speaking about this, the quoting of the people that have come before you, I find this idea fascinating. Do you think we could say that Beethoven is the first major composer that is aware of his place in history in this way? Or do you find that, let's say, Haydn and Mozart are as well? Or does this really start with Beethoven and saying, in 50 years, people will still be busy with my Hammerklavier? And This projection of music, not just for today and tomorrow and the day after, but really for the Ewigkeit.
I think if you want to talk about questions of succession, you know, taking the hand from Haydn and Mozart, I think, for example, not to mention Johann Sebastian Bach and Handel, a very great Handel enthusiast because he was interested in public music. I think this is true. That is not to say, though, that composers before that weren't also kind of interested in this, but Beethoven makes it so obvious that he wants to do something completely new from Haydn. So even in the early works of Beethoven, they sound quite different from Haydn, actually. There are some procedures. Also, there is this idea that Wagner also had, and he has this in common with Beethoven, that music has this potential which hasn't been utilized, yes, formal and so forth. And given the technological advances at the time, and also the idea that he wants to be a public figure, not necessarily a political figure, obviously, because he can't do that, but someone who can have an influence on the way people think, like Rousseau or Napoleon, even if it's meaning thinking differently about the relationship between the composer and his public, or between improvisation and strict composition, and certainly about performance. Here, C.P. Bach was greatly influential on Beethoven. He always used to recommend C.P. Bach's book on playing the piano to his students. So lots of technical issues, but also in historical terms, as something moving on to new forms of expression. I think it's the expressive potential of music is what Beethoven saw, and we can hear it now. It's huge.
And well, you've mentioned Rousseau in conjunction with Beethoven. Do you find some of the people that not only Wagner said were influential for him philosophically, but you actually think were influential for Wagner as philosophers and ideologists?
Yes. Well, this is a subject that, do you want another 6 seminars on this?
Well, you know, this initiative hopefully does continue, so yes. But
where we say, well, cut a long story short, I mean, we say, well, Beethoven was really into Immanuel Kant, who, by the way, was also very influenced by Rousseau. It's a major influence on the philosophy of Kant. I'm not quite sure that Beethoven, I can't imagine him sitting down and reading the Third Critique. I think the complexities of Kant, he was not interested in, but the somewhat simpler vision that Rousseau had of society and the complications of that, about the general will and so forth, I think he did take notice of that. Similarly with Wagner, he read Feuerbach and he read Schopenhauer, but you always have to think that Schopenhauer was a Rossini fan, and also a Kantian, incidentally. And Wagner turns him into a completely different figure, actually, although ironically, it's Wagner Schopenhauer that had an influence on the reputation of Schopenhauer more than Schopenhauer did at first. So what I'm saying is that composers have their own philosophies. Okay, it's not they read perhaps, but they formulate their own philosophies that don't always correspond with the ideas of these famous philosophers. And this is a contradiction that philosophers interested in music, like Rousseau, like Nietzsche, there aren't that many of them, and like Adorno, are very interested in this idea of musical technique, various other things about music, how that doesn't correspond with philosophical discourse. Okay, so you've got two things here: music, the technique of music, and philosophy and its own rules. Don't forget, philosophers have their rules which need to be broken. Kant, of course, is the locus classicus. Every philosopher has to read Kant because it's a kind of rule book, So it's what is within the limits of thought and so forth. It's a little bit similar to strict counterpoint in the 18th century. But these two things are not necessarily commensurable. And I think you have to bring those factors in when you're talking about this subject. So it's very easy to get and say, oh, he read Kant and therefore, this passage is Kantian or it's Schopenhauerian or whatever. It's too simple that way. That's not how composers think, in my view. I know one or two of them. They don't think that way.
Yes, that's why I was tempted to ask you, because the composers don't seem to adopt the philosophy of those that they read and or transmit it accurately, if that were at all possible. And philosophers that we so admire seem to be often possessing rather a pedestrian musical taste. Or
well, I mean, Hegel himself had to confess he didn't understand musicians. That's why he never talks about it, really. I mean, he couldn't equate musicians that he knew who were genius performers, fabulous on the fingering, but naive thinkers. How do these two things go together? That you must have thought processes that are very complicated and sophisticated to be a musician, but you're not the slightest bit interested in philosophy. So he doesn't really talk about it. He liked Rossini, by the way, and compared Rossini to a nightingale. Oh, and incidentally, in that film, the old girlfriend of Beethoven, Giucardi, is marrying a composer who writes in the style of Rossini, Gallenberg. And of course, that irritated Beethoven a great deal as well, because Rossini, as you know, was very popular in Vienna. Later, I'm talking about later on now. Beethoven did not like that competition at all. But coming back to the philosophical question, I think it is indeed a highly fraught issue. But I think the most interesting way forward is always to talk via these philosophers who really knew music and who knew how to move the notes around. I mean, the opera by Rousseau, you know, is incredibly competent, and his theories of music are still fascinating, the relationship between music and language. Nietzsche, have you ever heard of his, have you played any of them? Yeah, they tend to be rather terrible. Yes. But at least he knew how to manipulate the notes, you know, and knew what it means. It means to write notes on a page as well as think in philosophical terms. But Nietzsche was, in any case, a rebel against most forms of traditional philosophical thinking, which corresponds very well with his interest in music, because music is very difficult to pin down using these strict moral precepts of philosophy, in my view, especially Schubert.
Yeah, well, and then we also hit upon the limit that it seems that you can be incredibly talented or a genius in one field, and that just does not translate into something else, and that's
doesn't have to, does it?
And others that have
still, if you're talking not about composers, but about how music has its effect in society at large, and that includes popular music, of course, and music of all races, really. This leads into a very interesting and important field, I think. And certainly the kind of music that Beethoven was writing, which raises all sorts of issues about community versus the individual, as does Rousseau's philosophy. And, you know, what are the limits of coming together in the Brüderlichkeit of the Ninth Symphony? It can go either way. This is worth talking about, and in a way, it's a question that's separate from Beethoven. But we can talk about it.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question from Minyoung Kwan saying, do you think Strauss's two-tone poem cycles reflect his infatuation with Schopenhauer than Nietzsche, or is that too simplistic too? And she suggests, would you mind sharing this full lecture on YouTube? Well, we'll discuss that. Hopefully you'll agree. But do you think Strauss is also, in fact, referring to Nietzsche while thinking Schopenhauer, to put it in a reduced way?
Also sprach Zarathustra, yes. Now that is a very interesting question. Also, Strauss, you know, we need to have a conversation about Strauss's very bourgeois intellectual, but he did read Goethe and Nietzsche. In fact, he read the whole works of Goethe twice. He was an avid reader. And I think the Also sprach Zarathustra does take on board quite a few aspects of the difference between nature and so forth. And certainly the Alpine Symphony, which is one of his most Nietzschean works, actually, because it's about the fresh air on the mountain. It started out as a Nietzschean work, but his publisher said, don't do this, because Nietzsche wasn't religious and it won't appeal to some of your customers. So it was a business decision, but which aggravated Strauss, actually. So the answer to the question is that I do think Strauss took these philosophers seriously and read them with purpose, but it's still the issue that what comes out aesthetically, and if you want to turn it into a discourse of its own about the Alpine Symphony, which by the way is a fabulously interesting piece, it's already getting removed from the philosophy or the writings that originally inspired it. So there is always, as you rightly say, these differences that you need to bridge before we can have an interesting conversation about whether the one influences the other.
And I think before we should let you go, I cannot resist asking a question that also would take a whole semester of lectures at the very least. But you spoke about the expressive power of music and how Beethoven is busy with that, and certainly, well, composers thereafter and performers and listeners in today's very fraught situation in every way. I think we are all searching for ways of relevance to in today's society, in today's culture. And so we're talking about these, what we think and seem to agree are great monuments of Western culture, the Wagner operas, the Beethoven symphonies, but they do come from a very different time. And
yes.
How can we claim, or do we need to claim the relevance, or should we just let the things?
I don't think you need to claim anything, but I think one of the questions is, are they adequate for the present situation? Do we want to accept the values of a Beethoven straightforwardly? Is that appropriate for the situation we have now? For example, one of Beethoven's views, which he got from C.P. Bach, that part of music in the expressive thing was to get your audience wound up in the piece. That is to say, you're not listening to it objectively. The performer has to influence the audience if music is to mean anything. That's extremely difficult to do if we're in a lockdown situation. I mean, people can perform on Zoom, but without the audience there, it's much more difficult if you take this precept. And I think we can learn one or two things about that. How is it possible with the distancing? Well, you know, and if I were talking to you personally, it's a completely different position. If I was trying to influence you musically, but this is a hugely important part of Beethoven's view of music, which is why he liked improvising for 2 hours on end in front of total strangers sometimes. And it was also, by the way, something very important for Wagner, who, when he apparently is a fabulous conductor, wanted to get the audience swept up in what he's doing. And seeing that as an essential part of the composition, that is, in this situation we're in at the moment, that's very, very difficult to do. So as we don't have it, what do we have left?
Yes, the peaceful silence is carrying across Zoom.
Is that making sense then?
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's a wonderful banner to hang above the whole thing, that that music and art is there to, as at least one of the functions is to wind up its audience. And I think I was certainly wound up in your discourse and in your argument, for which I want to thank you very heartily, and for
that's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Speaking today. I wanted just to mention next week's seminar, which actually bridges nicely from John's talk today. It will be Ian Bostridge speaking about Schubert's Winterreise. And Ian, of course, has an excellent book that's out since about a year or two, which everybody is encouraged to familiarize themselves with. Winterreise, I think everybody is familiar with, but it's always good to discover more in that sense.
Fascinating book. Yes, yes.
Yes. And Ian sent these couple of sentences. What did and could Schubert's song cycle mean in 1827-28? What can it mean for us now? And why does it have such a compelling appeal? So from Tom's conversation last week about roots, seeds, and life cultures in music, to you showing both the roots, seeds, and life cultures, and also talking about the relevance today, we'll continue next week with Ian Bostridge. This is the registration link. I hope to see you there. And I really want to thank John Deathridge again for this excellent illuminating talk. And I do hope that you will agree to speak to us about more of these topics in the next semester.
Certainly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and stay healthy and have a good rest of your day.